Today I'm going to show you how to take fresh tomatoes and turn them into crushed tomatoes and then water bath can them to make them shelf stable for your pantry. So if you're new to water bath canning and water bath canning tomatoes specifically, this is the perfect video for you. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, sourdough, ferments, and more, and home canning basics. So if you enjoy learning about these things, consider subscribing to my channel, and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Now when it comes to canning, whether you're water bath canning or pressure canning, the first thing you want to do is get your canner ready. Now today I'm using an electric canner, but you can certainly use a stovetop canner. And if you don't have either, you can use a big stock pot. You're going to want to put your rack in your canner, and then you want to take your clean jars. In this case, we're going to use pint-sized jars. And you're going to want to take them all nice and clean and put them into your canner, and then fill your canner with water so that your jars are covered by 1 inch or 2 of water. And I'll overlay a picture so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Now, if you're using a stock pot and you don't have a particular rack that came with that, as it would with your canner, you can certainly use a cooling rack that you may have that you would cool cakes or cookies on, or you can just make a little rack. And the way that you do that is to just take some of your canning rings and just hook them together with twist ties and then put them down into your stock pot. And I show exactly how to do that in more detail in another video I have on water bath canning, where I show you how to make marmalade. And I'll be sure to link to that in the iCards. So once you get your canner filled with water and you've got your jars in there, all you want to do is turn it up to the point where you're going to bring it up to a simmer. And you just want to keep those jars in there nice and warm and simmering. And the same on your stove. If you're using a water bath canner or a stock pot, just bring it up to a simmer and let your jars simmer in there. You see mine starting to cycle and simmer, and keep them warm and ready when we take them out to fill with the hot crushed tomatoes. Now, that said, don't boil them. This is not the part where we boil them. You just want to have them simmering. Now I just want to mention, as I said, we're going to use pint-sized jars because I like to use pints when I make or when I can crush tomatoes, because I find this a very handy size. If you have a recipe and it just calls for a can of crushed tomatoes, this is the perfect size. And if you want to use it to make tomato sauce, you just use more than one of these. Now, you can also can them in a quart-sized jar. I generally reserve the quart-sized jars for when I can the whole tomato, the skin removed, but you might see in your grocery store whole tomatoes sold in the can, and I prefer to use the quart-sized jar for that. But for crushed tomatoes, I like the pint size. Now a note about when it comes to water bath canning tomatoes, even though tomatoes are a high acid food and high acid foods can be water bath canned, all tomatoes, whether they're store-bought or homegrown, can vary in acidity. And so to be careful and to make sure that there's enough acid in each jar to allow it to be water bath canned and to make it shelf stable, we want to add a little extra acid to each jar. Now in our discussions about water bath canning, I know some of you have told me that you've had a lot of trouble canning tomatoes. And then when I mentioned the point about adding a little extra acid, you said, oh my goodness, that was a light bulb moment because you hadn't added in any extra acid. And that's where you can run into trouble if you're water bath canning tomatoes without it. So some options for the acid that you're going to need is going to be the bottled lemon juice from the grocery store. In canning tomatoes, we don't want to use fresh lemon juice. We can use fresh lemon juice when we make jam, but not when we water bath can tomatoes. You want the exact acidity that is guaranteed in a bottled lemon juice, as opposed to varying acidity in a fresh lemon juice. The other option is you can purchase citric acid, and this just happens to be one by the Ball Canning Company that's sold. And you should be able to find this at your grocery store or any of the big box stores. And this is another option that you can use. Now today, I'm just going to be using the bottled lemon juice. Now, when it comes to adding salt, you can either add salt or not add salt. I prefer not to add salt to my crushed tomatoes because it's not necessary. It doesn't help to preserve the tomatoes or make them shelf stable. It is simply a flavoring in the case of the amount of salt that we would be using, which for a pint would be about 1/2 teaspoon. And the reason that I don't like to add salt is that this way, since I'll be using these crushed tomatoes in a recipe, I can add the salt at that time, and I know that I'm not dealing with something that may have salt in it and not be sure exactly of how that flavor will affect my recipe. So it's up to you. If you do want to add salt, you certainly can, and know that it's just for flavoring, and add an amount that you're comfortable with, which usually, as I said, for a pint-sized jar is about a half a teaspoon. It doesn't affect the shelf stableness of the tomatoes. It doesn't involve any preserving in terms of the tomatoes. So know that it's going to be simply used for a flavoring if you decide to use it. So even if you do add salt for flavoring, you still need to add your lemon juice, because the lemon juice is what is going to help us bring this to the right acidity and preserve them and make them shelf stable with a water bath canning method. Now, I just want to go over all the other supplies that you're going to need, because you want to get everything ready, because once we're done making these or cooking these into crushed tomatoes, we want to have all of our canning supplies ready so that we can go ahead and jar everything up. Now, you're going to want a jar lifter. I love this one. It's spring-loaded. It's so easy to use, and I'll be sure to put a link in the description below if you want to find one of these. But this is a wonderful, and you definitely need a jar lifter. Then you're going to want a funnel. I like this one only because it has headspace measures, but you can certainly use a stainless steel one. The most important thing to keep in mind is, because we are working with tomatoes, which are, as I said, an acid food, you do not want to use any aluminum, because the aluminum and the acid in the tomatoes will react together and create an off flavor. So I'm just going to use a plastic one here, and then the funnel. And then you're also going to want a nice scoop, because you're going to need something to scoop the cooked product, the cooked tomatoes in this case, and put them into your jar. This is a lovely ladle. I like it because it has a little hook on the back here that makes it easy to hook onto the side of the pot and not slide down. I'll be sure to put a link to this below. The next thing, you're going to want some sort of debubbler tool. I like using this little one because it also has the measures for headspace, but you can use a little spatula, a little spoon, a little knife, whatever you have, but this is very handy. And I'll put links to everything below if you're new to canning and you're looking for these types of supplies. So this is a debubbler, and it's nice because it's got the little headspace measures that allow us to measure on the jar, 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, so on and so forth. And that's very important when you're canning, because the headspace for different jars and different foods and whatnot varies. So that's a great tool because it's got everything there measured out for you. Next, you're going to want to have your rings, and you do not put these in any sort of boiling water. You simply just wash them and keep them warm. Wash them and keep them warm. Wash them and keep them clean. And then the next thing that you're going to want to do is have your lids ready. Now, this, I'm just going to show you, I'm just using this little tool. This is a little lid lifter. It's got a magnet on the end. And I like to keep my lids in some nice warm water that's just been brought up to warm on the stove and then just set aside. And the reason is I find this keeps them very clean and nice and warm and ready to put on the jars. But you never, let me just put this down, you never want to boil these, because there is a rubber seal here, and if you boil these, it could damage that rubber seal and then not make a good seal when we go to water bath can them. Now, new rules say that all you need to do is wash these in warm soapy water, dry them, rinse them well, dry them, and keep them clean, just like your rings, while you're waiting to get ready to can. That you can certainly do that. I like to just keep them in a little warm water that I warmed on the stove. That's how I was taught, and so I continue to do that. I feel it keeps everything very clean, but certainly you can skip that step and just wash them, dry them, and keep them clean and waiting for when you're ready to can. And as I mentioned, this is just a jar lifter. It's got a little magnet on the end, and you'll want one of these, because this keeps the jar lids very clean so that you're not touching them as you put them down on top of your filled jar. And the next thing you're going to want to put aside and have ready is just a little bowl here of white vinegar and a clean paper towel, because we're going to want to go over the jars and make sure that they're in good condition and make them nice and clean before we apply the lids. So now you've got everything ready, and we're ready to turn these into crushed tomatoes. Now, to get ready to prepare the tomatoes, we want to set up a few pots and various other things. And the first thing we want to do is just get a nice big pot where we'll put in the skinned tomatoes to cook them. And this can be either stainless steel or enameled cast iron. Again, since we are working with tomatoes, you don't want to use aluminum, and just plain cast iron can also interact with the acidity in the tomatoes and create a little bit of an off flavor. So make sure it's stainless steel or enameled cast iron. The next thing you're going to want to do is get a little stock pot and fill it with water, because this is what we're going to dip the tomatoes into. We're going to bring this water up to a soft boil, high simmer, and we're going to dip them in for about 60 seconds. And then the next thing you're going to want to have ready is a bowl of ice water, because after we plunge the tomatoes in here for about 60 seconds, then we're going to remove them and plunge them into here in the ice water bath. And then we're going to, that'll cause the skins to crack, and that will, then we'll peel the tomatoes, and then we'll put them in the pot and get ready to cook them. Now, the reason is you've got to have this all set up and ready to go is because once we skin the tomatoes, we're going to chop them. And when we chop them, what happens, a chemical reaction starts to take place. And tomatoes have pectin, but once you start to cut them up, it starts to break, for lack of a better word, the pectin, and it can start to make them very watery. And then that will create a watery crushed tomatoes, or if you're making a sauce with them, a watery tomato sauce. And what happens is, though, if we put them into a nice warm pot and start cooking them, the heat will stop the breakdown of the pectin, and that way we won't have watery crushed tomatoes. Well, I'm going to bring this up to a soft boil, and I'll show you, or a high simmer soft boil, and we'll start putting our tomatoes in, and I'll bring you in close so you can see everything that we do. Now, we're going to be making 6 pints of crushed tomatoes. And so in your canner, you're going to want to have 6 jars being brought to a simmer, and add an extra one just in case, so that if you have some extra crushed tomatoes that you need to can, you've got that jar ready. Now, to make those 6 pints of crushed tomatoes, you're going to need between 8 and 9 pounds of tomatoes, leaning a little closer to 8 pounds. But don't worry if you don't have a scale, especially if you've homegrown them and you don't have a scale, you're not at the grocery store weighing them. What we're going to do is, as we dip them and skin them and get them ready to put in the pot and cook, we're going to measure them by the cupful. And we're going to want to have 12 cups of chopped tomatoes. Well, I've got this up to a soft boil, a high simmer, and I'll overlay a picture so you can see exactly what that means if you're new to all of this. And we're going to do only a few tomatoes at a time. I'm only going to put in 4 tomatoes at a time, and then we're going to scoop them out and plunge them into the ice water. And I'm going to bring you in closer so now you can see all of this as we go through this process. So I've got my little spider here. I've got, this is what I call the spider. I've got 4 tomatoes, and I'm just going to go ahead and put those into this water. And I'm going to let them just boil in there for 60 seconds. Then I'm going to scoop them out, and we'll put them in the ice bath. This is exactly what we're looking for. After 60 seconds, the skins have split. And just keep your eye on it. Sometimes it can be 30 seconds, but I usually find with the aromas it takes about 60 seconds. So I'm going to submerge this right now to stop any cooking into the ice water. There we go. We'll get all of them right into that ice water bath. And these are split also. So we've plunged these tomatoes into the boiling water and then put them right into the ice bath after about a minute. And as you see, these skins just come right off. Isn't that beautiful? Now, don't throw out these skins, because you can dehydrate these. You can, if you have a dehydrator, or you can dry them in the oven and make a wonderful tomato powder. So we'll put those aside for right now. And I just left these in the ice water bath for a couple of seconds, less than 30 seconds, and brought them out. And as you saw, the skin came off beautifully. And then what we're going to want to do is just start to cut these up, and we want to work quickly. Now, you have a couple of options. I like to just take out this part of the core. All I do is cut out this little stem, and again, I'm not going to throw that out. I'm going to dehydrate that to make a tomato powder. Now, the fact that I'm using Italian plum tomatoes, and you can do this with any kind of tomato you want, but I find Italian plums to really, or the aromas, they're called Italian Roma tomatoes. I find these to be my favorite. Now, you can take this core out if you want, or you can simply keep it in along with the seeds and just chop up your tomato. And that's usually what I do. I don't give myself any extra work, and I don't find the core or the seeds to be a problem. And now we'll just go ahead, pick this all up, working quickly, put that into our cup, and we'll measure out our first cup, and then we'll add that to the pot in which we're going to cook these tomatoes. I've got my first cup of crushed tomatoes, and now we'll go ahead and put these in our pot that we're going to cook them in. Now I'm going to take our first cup of crushed tomatoes. I'm going to put this into a pot that's warm and waiting, because as I said, we want to make sure that we keep these tomatoes cooking so that they don't get too watery. I'm just going to give them a little bit of a mashing here just to get them going. And now we'll go ahead and we'll blanch the rest of the tomatoes and cut them up and add them in here until we have our pot full of 12 cups of tomatoes. Well, I've got my complete 12 cups of chopped tomatoes in here, and I've just been having it simmer as I've been adding 1 cup after another to keep it nice and warm. Now we're going to bring it up to a boil for 5 minutes. But before we do that, I just want to mention that as I showed you, I cut just the stem end out of my Italian plum tomatoes because I always find that the rest of the bit of core usually just cooks down and it's fine. But in case as you're doing this, you find a piece that just is maybe a little tough and a little stubborn and really just doesn't want to cook down, you can scoop those out with a spoon. But overall, I usually, as I said, just cut out the bottom stem there, and everything else seems to cook down quite well. But if you do find a few pieces like that, you can easily scoop them out. Now I'm going to boil these for 5 minutes and just kind of stir them. I don't want anything to burn, and just crush them as I go along. But in 5 minutes, we'll remove these from the heat and we'll get ready to can them up. Well, our crushed tomatoes are all cooked and looking beautiful, and I've got these jars simmering. So now what I'm going to do is remove this lid, and be very careful when you do this. Open the lid away from you, whether you're doing this with the electric one canner or the one on the stove, so that no steam comes towards you. And I've got 7 pint-sized jars in there. I think this is going to make about 6 pint-sized jars, but as I said, it's always good to have an extra jar just in case. Now we're going to use our jar lifter, and I'm going to take out 1 jar. I'm just going to reach down in here and get this. Then you're going to want to lift it up very carefully, hold on tight, and you're going to want to empty the water out. The next thing I like to do is just check and make sure that none of the top, the jar is in good condition, that none of the top has any nicks or cracks or anything on it. And I'm just going to take a little paper towel, clean paper towel, and I'm going to dip it in a little bit of white vinegar. Now I'm going to do this again before I put the lid on, after we fill the jars, in case it's gotten dirty. But I like to do this at this point just to make sure that during the simmering process, the jars didn't bang together and potentially put a nick on top. You really want to make sure that the top of your jar is perfect so that it can take that lid and make a nice seal. Well, that looks perfect. Now the first thing that we want to do is add our acid. And in this case, I'm using the lemon juice, so we want 1 tablespoon of lemon juice per pint jar. If you decided to use the citric acid, you're going to use 1/4 teaspoon of citric acid per jar. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in, and you want to add this individually to each jar as opposed to adding a whole bunch to the crushed tomatoes, because you want to make sure that you have exactly 1 tablespoon of lemon juice, of the bottled lemon juice, per jar, per pint jar. Now we've got our funnel. We're going to put that over our jar, and we're going to start to ladle in our crushed tomatoes until we get to what we think is about 1/2 inch from the top of our jar, and then we'll use our jar debubbler to not only debubble the jar, but to also measure the headspace. Now, as I mentioned, this funnel has measurements that will also tell you if you've reached the half inch of headspace. And this looks like it's about 1/2 inch, but I'm going to debubble this, because when we debubble it, that'll also move things around as we release some air. And as we pull out the debubbler, it may also take some of the crushed tomatoes with us, or with it. and we may need to replenish a little bit. So what I like to do, that looks good, is just keep a clean teaspoon handy, so in case I need to add a little bit more when we measure the headspace, I'm not trying to do it with the ladle. Okay, now the second notch is a 1/2 inch. So let's see. Oh yeah, we definitely need to add some more. So I just used the teaspoon to add a little bit more, measured it with the debubbler headspace measurer, and it looks like we're perfect at a 1/2 inch headspace. And I'm going to overlay a close-up shot of this so that you can see exactly what I was doing with the measurer for the headspace. Now I'm going to take my paper towel, dip it again in a little bit of vinegar, and I'm just going to go around and clean this top in case any of the crushed tomatoes got on this when I was pouring it in. Now I'm going to use my lid lifter to take out one of my lids from the pot that I've got it soaking in here in this warm water. You don't dry anything off, just put it right down on top of your jar. Now you take your ring and you're just going to put it on, and you're going to put this ring on finger tight. And I'm going to bring you in for a close-up to show you exactly what I mean. So by finger tight, all we mean is that you go to the point where you feel resistance. So you're going along with your ring and you suddenly can't turn it anymore. No brute force, nothing like that. You simply just can't turn it. And then when you get to that point where you meet resistance, you just turn it a little bit more, very gently, and that's it. No brute force. And the reason that fingertip tight is so important is because this band, this ring, is only being used to hold that lid in place while it's boiling in the canner. It's just to hold it in place, but not tightly, because as it boils, oxygen, air, is escaping from the jar, because that's what you want to happen, because oxygen in the air is our enemy, which can cause spoilage. So we want as much air to come out of the jar as possible. So you just want this ring to serve the purpose of holding this lid in place, but not too tight that the air can't escape. So as it's boiling, the air escapes, and then when you lift your jar out of the canner and put it down to rest, you hear that ping, that canners are familiar with, where the change in temperature will cause the lid to create a suction. And then after it's cooled for 24 hours, then you're just going to loosen this ring. And so it really serves no purpose other than to just hold the lid in place while it's boiling in the canner. And the reason why you remove the ring, did I say that before? You remove the ring when you go to put it in long-term storage after it's had a chance to cool for 24 hours, is because if you left the ring on and the seal later down the road failed, if the ring is on, the lid may seal again and create a false seal. You don't want that to happen, because then the air has gotten in and there could be spoilage. But if the lid fails and the ring isn't on, well, then the lid would be loose and you would know that the seal wasn't good enough. So all you want to do is go till you have resistance and then a little more. And that's fingertip tight. Nothing more than that. And the reason also, which is very important, is if you were to put brute force and really tighten this, as this boiled in the canner and that air couldn't be released, there's a potential for the jar to break, and we really want to avoid that. Now that you've got your jar filled and your lid is on and your ring is screwed to fingertip tight, you're just going to take this first jar and you're going to put it down into your simmering water, and it'll sit in there and it'll wait until we get each jar filled. And at that point, once we have all the jars filled, we'll bring it up to the boil. So now I'll go ahead and fill the rest of my jars. Well, I've got my 5 jars in here and they're simmering, and now I'm going to turn it up to high to bring this up to a boil. And once it comes up to a boil, that's when we'll set our timer. And we're going to want to boil these pint jars for 35 minutes. If you're using quart jars, you'll want to boil them for 45 minutes. But we don't start the countdown until this actually comes up to a boil. Then we'll set the timer for 35 minutes. Hopefully you can hear me over this as it's coming up to a boil, but I'm going to overlay a photograph so that you can see how I put the 5 jars of the crushed tomatoes into the canner. And I want to mention, you might be saying, oh, I thought we were going to do 6 jars. Yes, that was my plan, but I don't have quite enough crushed tomatoes to fill my 6th jar to that 1/2-inch headspace. So I'm just going to use these tonight, maybe put them on, make a bruschetta or something like that. And so I did have the 7th jar in case I got lucky and had more than enough for the 6 jars. But I've taken out both the 6th jar and the 7th jar, and I have only 5 full jars in here, and then I'll save this to use for dinner tonight. Well, I let this boil for 35 minutes, and my timer went off, and I turned this off, and then I just let it sit for a few minutes just to let the boiling calm down. And now I'm going to remove the lid, and we'll begin to take our jars out. When we take our jars out, we want to use our jar lifter and get a secure grip on our first jar, and then we want to lift these straight out. We don't want to tip them, just bring them straight out, and then put them down onto some type of dish towel, or this is one of those drying mats. You want something that has a little cushion, and we're just going to let that sit there. And now we'll take our next jar out, and I'll just continue to take all the jars out. And remember, keep them straight. Dipping! Now we're going to let these beautiful jars, these pint jars of crushed tomatoes, sit here for 24 hours. And after that, we're going to remove the rings, and then we're going to put them in the pantry, and they'll be shelf stable for 18 months, because 18 months is what the manufacturer, Ball in this case, says that their lids are good for 18 months. Now I know a lot of canners will say they keep them longer and so on and so forth, but I just wanted to tell you what the actual manufacturer says. If you'd like to learn more about traditional cooking, be sure to subscribe to my channel, and then click on this video over here where I show you how to make a low-sugar strawberry jam and water bath can it from start to finish. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.